Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a brief look at Star Wars Jedi Survivor performance using just a few select hardware configurations, as we're going about this one a bit different to past benchmarks, but the big GPU comparison is coming, so don't worry about that. I've got half a dozen EA Play memberships all lined up, ready to get around those hardware change limitations, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on in the video. Now, you might have heard that there is a bit of drama surrounding this game, namely involving how it plays on PC, and much of that is warranted. That said, in a rather unfortunate way, the game has played, and I don't really know how to characterize this without offending the gaming community, as it appears to be a very touchy subject, but it played okay for me. The very first playthrough on our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with the RTX 4070 was mostly good. It was certainly a mostly smooth experience. And yeah, there was the odd frame stutter here and there, especially when transitioning to cutscenes, which I'm certainly not saying is acceptable or trying to brush it under the rug, but it really wasn't the horrible stuttery mess that many have described. But that's not to say they're entirely wrong either, because I have seen plenty of third-party evidence. And of course, we are using one of the, if not the fastest gaming CPU available right now, with a pretty solid GPU, so you'd expect good results. And even with such powerful hardware, there were occasional frame stutters, and the frame rate wasn't exactly amazing. The game does look incredible, but EA clearly has some work ahead of them, and they have acknowledged this, but it is EA, so I wouldn't hold your breath, but hopefully gamers can get an update soon. Now, an obvious red flag for me, indicating that the game would require further optimization, was the horrible user interface. The menu system is so bad with a mouse. You can use the mouse to enable or disable some of the settings, such as VSync and ray tracing, for example, but then for stuff like quality settings, you can select those with the mouse, but you can't alter them in any way. Very silly. You need to select them, then use the A or D keys to change the option. And if you happen to double click with the mouse, it deselects the option entirely, and then you have to re-click on it and then use either of the keys to change the option. Once you are happy with the changes, you have to hit enter or spacebar, and for stuff like resolution changes, you have to hold and wait. So it's pretty bad. No idea why they thought this was a good idea. And worse still, it's kind of a carryover from the previous game's menu, which again was pretty terrible in that respect. And I suppose even worse still is the fact that some of the settings only apply when you reset the game. So therefore, it is best to make the necessary changes, exit the game, and then load back in. And if you don't do this, you can actually run into some pretty horrific performance-related problems, which I suspect is probably the root cause of a lot of people's performance-related problems in this game. Though you would think most gamers would work out when they close the game and then load back in, it does play a lot better. Anyway, not exactly sure what is going on there, but I do know changing settings in-game and then not resetting the game is a bad idea. So at this point, I've closed open this game well over 100 times, as I do need to ensure that when I'm benchmarking, I'm using the correct settings and of course getting the correct performance. But once I got past the clunky menu and into the game, I was pleasantly surprised by, dare I say, how good this Unreal Engine 4 game played and looked. The graphics, map design, and detail are impressive. Not UE5 impressive, but they're still very good. Texture quality is excellent, and this is a large part of why the game does look so good. Of course, with high resolution textures, VRAM requirements do grow, and while the game does appear to require more than 8GB at 1080p and 1440p using the high-end Epic settings, it still played very well on 8GB graphics cards such as the RTX 3070. And given how much focus has been placed on VRAM performance here at Hardware Unboxed over the last few weeks, I thought it'd be interesting to start this comparison between the GeForce RTX 3070 and Radeon RX 6800. And having seen the VRAM usage, I wasn't that confident in the RTX 3070. Really didn't think it was going to fare that well here, but providing you have enough CPU power, it's actually pretty decent. The RTX 3070 is certainly slower in terms of FPS performance, but that's generally be expected when matching up these two GPUs, and despite running around 16% slower, it did cost 14% less at MSRP. So in terms of performance per frame, they are pretty similar in this example. Also, please be aware that what you are seeing here is a first run of the game, and that means shader compilation stutter is going to be most prevalent, as the shaders haven't already cached, at least not completely. And what's interesting here is that as soon as I loaded into the game, the RX 6800 saw VRAM usage at just over 8GB, and in just over 2 minutes of playing the game, that ballooned out to 10GB before maxing out at 12.5GB. The RTX 3070, on the other hand, had to work within its 8GB frame buffer, but somehow it does seem to do that quite well with no stuttering, at least stuttering that wasn't also seen with 16GB of VRAM. There was no crashing, and as far as I could tell, no missing textures. And although the bulk of the screen recordings were done at 1440p using the high quality preset with ray tracing disabled, as those settings in my opinion are more reasonable for products like the RX 6800 and RTX 3070 in this title, the 3070 still managed to avoid horrible frame time performance even with ray tracing enabled, and we'll look at that data in the form of a few bar graphs now. First up, here's our testing from the Coruscant Rooftops checkpoint using the Epic quality preset with upscaling and ray tracing disabled, and at 1080p, the RX 6800 was 29% faster than the RTX 3070 and delivered more consistent frame time performance. Then at 1440p, the margin was reduced, but even so, the Radeon GPU was still 16% faster and again delivered much better 1% lows. And both were playable here, but the RX 6800 was noticeably better. Then, as you might have suspected, neither are really suitable 4K gamers using the maximum quality settings. Now for the ray tracing testing, I've dialed down the quality preset from Epic to high as I feel that's a better balance for these GPUs. And at 1080p, the RX 6800 was 41% faster than the RTX 3070 and a massive 57% faster when looking at the 1% lows. The GeForce GPU wasn't terrible by any means, but the RX 6800 was able to deliver a smoother experience. Then at 1440p, we're still looking at solid performance with the RX 6800 at around 60 FPS, making it 13% faster than the RTX 3070. And of course, 4K is again out of the question unless you really dig 30 FPS gaming. It's my opinion that the best configuration for these GPUs is the high preset with ray tracing disabled, as this allowed for over 100 FPS at 1080p with the RX 6800 and a very playable 84 FPS with the RTX 3070. Meanwhile, at 1440p, the RX 6800 was good for 88 FPS, making it 28% faster than the RTX 3070, and you'll absolutely notice the difference between these two GPUs. Now, using the high preset at 4K does start to become feasible, especially with the RX 6800, though 42 FPS wasn't a great experience in my opinion, but it did seem to reduce the amount of stuttering I was seeing, probably because the lower frame rate does lessen at the CPU load. Then, if you really want to test the CPU limits of the game with a previous generation mid-range GPU, just use the medium quality preset. The RX 6800 maxed out the 7800X 3D at just over 100 FPS, which is a bit sad, while the added driver overhead or perhaps lack of driver optimization on Nvidia's side capped frame rates much sooner at just over 80 FPS, so a poor result for GeForce owners in that sense. Of course, the game is very playable, but if you're after a high refresh rate experience, you'll be very disappointed. For me, the game was extremely CPU limited on Coruscant, and this is despite poorly utilizing all of the CPUs that I tested, so that's a shame, and hopefully this will be addressed with a game update soon. Moving to Koboh did reduce this bottleneck, and while CPU limitations certainly still reared their ugly head here, it was far less of a problem. Using the Epic settings, we appear to be mostly GPU limited with the RTX 3070 and RX 6800, as performance in Koboh is similar to Coruscant. The same is mostly true of the high plus ray tracing results, though this time the RTX 3070 behaves more as expected when testing at 1080p, basically matching the RX 6800, but the 1440p and 4K results were much the same. Disabling ray tracing but sticking with the high preset, we see that at 1440p and 4K, performance on Koboh is again similar to Coruscant, as we're again mostly GPU limited, but at 1080p, we see a 16% boost for the RX 6800 and a massive 27% boost for the RTX 3070. Then with the medium quality preset, the 1080p and 1440p performance is boosted substantially. The RX 6800, for example, saw a 66% boost to the frame rate, and the RTX 3070 an even bigger 85% boost. This is the kind of performance that should be possible throughout the game using these quality settings, but sadly, with very poor CPU utilization, it's just not possible in the more demanding sections, at least the sections that demand more CPU performance. And to better illustrate that point, here's how the Koboh and Coruscant tests compare using the RTX 3070. Both sections do poorly utilize the CPU, but the Koboh test just requires less of the CPU, which reduces the CPU bottleneck, freeing up the GPU to perform as it should. There's less stuttering in this test as well, and I'm sure RTX 3070 owners would be much happier with 110 FPS opposed to just 83, not to mention the almost 40% improvement in 1% lows. Now, as I noted earlier, Star Wars Jedi Survivor has faced a lot of backlash over its PC performance, as in its frame rate performance. And EA has publicly addressed this and, quite bizarrely, has claimed that the bulk of the issues are due to gamers using cutting-edge, multi-threaded chipsets designed for Windows 11 on Windows 10. So it's the fault of the gamers for using the wrong operating system. Pretty bizarre take, and this really did seem very odd to me, as generally speaking, in the testing we've done, there's very little difference between the two operating systems when it comes to gaming performance. They're just much the same, even with the latest and greatest PC hardware. Still, the claims are worth investigating, so I installed Windows 10 on a separate SSD on our AM5 test system and ran the 7800X3D again, as that's quite a cutting-edge multi-threaded product. Quite humorously, the game actually ran slightly smoother on Windows 10. Granted, it was a fresh install of the operating system on a brand new high-speed SSD, but I think the point is, clearly Windows 10 is not to blame here, or gamers for using Windows 10. Both operating systems saw very poor utilization of the CPU, and this is of course the primary issue here. So again, I really hope they're able to address this, but I won't be holding my breath. I think it is fair to say that I'm coming away from my initial testing of the game with mixed feelings. Should the game have shipped in a better state? Yeah, of course it should have. And sadly, you can say that about the vast majority of PC games. But is all the drama and outrage justified? Well, I guess it depends on your personal experience with the game. Certainly, most people are having issues with the game. Our video editor, Balin, for example, he has an RTX 4090 and a Core i9 1300K, and his game stutters very poorly, even worse, or at least as bad as what I was seeing with the 10600K and 3800X. So, a bit strange there, and again, I was only using an RTX 3070, so I'm not sure why certain configurations that should play the game really well aren't, and then others seem okay. Again, most of the people that I've heard from that are seeing okay performance do have something like a 7800X 3D CPU and generally a Radeon GPU. But yeah, performance does seem to be a bit all over the place, but the norm is to see heavy stuttering, which is a shame. The shader compilation stuttering, and in particular traversal stuttering, was certainly more frequent and more jarring with lower end hardware, which did spoil the game when compared to what I initially experienced with much higher end hardware. But it was still playable, and I just have to stress that I'm by no means saying that it's acceptable for a AAA title, so relax, take a deep breath. I'm merely pointing out that the experience will vary depending on the configuration. So while I've shown the game to generally run smoothly with last season's mid-range GPU paired with the world's fastest gaming CPU, I realized this isn't necessarily the norm. The Core i5 10600K, for example, it wasn't as smooth as the 7800X 3D, no shockers there I suppose, and stuttering was not only more frequent, but when it occurred, it lasted longer, which was a far more jarring experience. And if I downgraded the Core i5 from 32GB to just 16GB of RAM, there was even more stuttering. So again, that certainly does spoil the experience. But it was also nice to see that in such a beautiful game, 8GB of VRAM appeared to work just fine, though I've only had the chance to play a little over an hour into the game with the RTX 3070, outside of my benchmark using the save point on Koboh. But I guess what I'm saying is I haven't played the game extensively with an 8GB graphics card. But let's move on, and I guess we'll touch on the menu system again, which is just horrible. It's very clunky and annoying to use, and the lack of DLSS support is also disappointing, and DLSS 3 frame generation, which actually could be pretty useful in this title. Though, of course, that would only help out a very small portion of gamers. Still, these are features that should be present in any new AAA title. But the big issue for Star Wars Jedi Survivor is the terrible CPU utilization. Using 30% of a Core i5 10600K while being heavily CPU limited is just total crap. Granted, when the stuttering did occur, CPU usage briefly spiked up to 50 to 60%, but even then the primary thread was never maxed out. So it stands to reason, had the CPU been better utilized, then we wouldn't have seen nearly as many stutters, and the ones that you would see probably wouldn't be as noticeable. In many instances, the system was spitting out less than 60 FPS at 1440p using the high quality settings with an RTX 3070, and despite that, CPU usage was around 30% with no maxed out cores, while GPU usage hovered at 70%. So fixing CPU usage should be the primary goal here. And the last challenge I faced with this content, and I suppose the upcoming big GPU benchmark, is EA's DRM, which prevents gamers from being able to play EA app titles after more than 5 hardware changes. And worse still, if you just happen to change the PCs you're playing on, it'll lock you out for 24 hours right away, which is just a nightmare for testing. And it's a crap experience for people who have paid for the game. They might want to play on their home theater PC and then the main PC. Don't know if it's always going to do that. I've seen a lot of people online complaining about this problem when they've changed PCs. Total garbage from EA, especially when there's actual games released to Steam or even the Epic Store, Ubisoft games, all of those sort of games. Most of them, you can have limitless hardware changes. That's not what will lock you out of the account. So this is something EA's been doing for over a decade now, and it's just crap. That's really the best way to describe it. It's just a crap situation for everyone. You can't play EA games on multiple different systems, and I can't deliver big benchmarks in a timely manner. And it's even more horrific in this instance, as I've had to play on 6 different accounts to Koboh, as you can't copy save games to other accounts. Anyway, a big GPU benchmark is in the works, and that should be ready in a few days' time. We'll see how I go swapping all those accounts over. And as I said, I've had to play multiple accounts to at least the 10% mark so we can do all of our testing. But anyway, keep an eye out for all of that. And in the meantime, if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, get access to our exclusive Discord server, extra content, Q&As, live streams, all that kind of stuff, then yeah, check out Floatplane and Patreon. But other than that, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.